She was 52 years old, alone on a burning train platform, with 3 coins in her pocket and a name that had been dragged through every saloon and courthouse in the county. They called her a thief. They called her worse. The man who destroyed her had money, power, and a smile that made juries believe anything. And Eleanor Whitaker had nothing left but the truth. Most women in her position would have disappeared quietly. Eleanor wasn't most women. What happened next didn't just save one ranch, it shook the entire frontier to its foundation. This is her story. If this story moves you, drop the name of your city in the comments. I want to see how far Eleanor's journey has traveled. Hit like and stay with us until the very end. The summer of 1894 arrived in Colton Creek like a punishment. By the middle of June, the sky above the Kansas plains had turned a shade of white so pale and merciless it barely qualified as blue anymore. The earth cracked in long, jagged lines, as though the ground itself was splitting under the weight of the heat. Horses stood motionless in their paddocks, too exhausted to swat the flies crawling across their flanks. Old men who had lived through droughts before said quietly that this one felt different, heavier somehow, like the sky was pressing down with intention. But inside the Whitmore Grand Hotel, the largest establishment in Colton Creek, none of that heat seemed to touch the lobby. Brass ceiling fans turned slowly overhead. A vase of fresh-cut wildflowers, replaced every morning without fail, sat on the reception desk. The floors were swept, the linens pressed, the kitchen humming with the rhythm of a well-ordered operation. That was Eleanor Whitaker's doing, every single bit of it. Eleanor had been managing the Whitmore Grand for 21 years. She had never held the title of manager, that belonged to a succession of men whose names came and went like seasons, men who smiled at the owner, shook the right hands at dinner, and collected their salaries while Eleanor quietly held everything together beneath them. She had built the supply relationships, trained every housekeeper and cook, negotiated contracts with the linen company in Wichita, and once, during the terrible winter of 1887, personally kept the pipes from freezing by staying up for 3 nights straight with heated stones wrapped in flannel. No one gave her credit for that either. Eleanor didn't have the kind of face that drew compliments anymore, if it ever had. She was a tall woman, not slender, with broad shoulders that spoke of years of actual physical labor rather than decoration. Her dark hair had gone mostly silver in the last decade, pulled back each morning into a tight, practical knot. Her hands were rougher than they should have been for a woman in her position, but her position had never been what it appeared. Behind every polished surface in the Whitmore Grand was Eleanor's fingerprints and Eleanor's hours. She didn't complain. She had long ago stopped expecting recognition. What she expected, what she had built her entire existence around, was order, competence, the quiet, irreplaceable satisfaction of a system that worked. Harlan Boggs arrived on a Thursday afternoon in early July. Eleanor was reviewing invoices in the back office when she heard his voice in the lobby. Loud, too loud, the kind of voice that expected rooms to rearrange themselves around its volume. She didn't come out immediately. She finished the line she was reading, set her pen down precisely, and then walked out to see what the noise was about. He was standing at the front desk, leaning on it with one elbow the way men do when they want to demonstrate they belong everywhere. He was perhaps 60, with a gut that strained against a very expensive vest, and a hat that had probably cost more than Eleanor made in a month. 2 younger men flanked him carrying bags. His boots were spotless despite the dust outside. Someone cleaned them for him, Eleanor noticed, every single day. Harlan Boggs, he said to the young clerk, as if announcing something. Railroad business. I'll need your finest suite, long term. Could be 6 weeks, could be 6 months. Depends on how the negotiations go. Eleanor already knew who he was. Everyone in the region did. Harlan Boggs was the primary investor and operating agent for the Western Continental Railroad, the company currently buying up land across 3 counties to extend a rail line that would, depending on who you asked, either bring prosperity to the frontier or crush independent landowners beneath iron wheels. He was known for getting what he wanted. He was also known for how he went about getting it. Mr. Boggs, Eleanor said, stepping forward with the calibrated warmth she deployed for important guests. Welcome to the Whitmore Grand. I'm Eleanor Whitaker. I oversee operations here. We've been expecting your party. He looked at her the way men like him always looked at women like her. A swift, dismissive inventory settling somewhere around her age and finding it uninteresting. Good, he said, already looking away. See to it my men have what they need. She saw to it. She always did. For the first week, Harlan Boggs was merely unpleasant. He sent meals back for reasons that contradicted themselves. He complained about noise at hours when the hotel was perfectly quiet. He summoned staff with the kind of urgency normally reserved for emergencies, only to ask trivial questions. Eleanor managed it all without expression, because that was what she did. The second week, something shifted. It began with small things she noticed, but couldn't name directly. The way his gaze followed her when she moved through the dining room, the unnecessary questions he found reasons to ask her specifically rather than the front desk clerk. Then came the evening he appeared at the back office door while she was working late. "You run a tight ship," he said, settling himself into the chair across from her desk without being invited. "The hotel has good systems," Eleanor replied, not looking up from her ledger. "They work because everyone follows them." "Modest," he smiled. "I've seen the books, you know. Gerald showed me. This place makes more than it should for a town this size. That's your doing, isn't it?" Eleanor finally looked up. "The staff deserves the credit. Don't be coy." He leaned forward. "I know what it means when a woman like you says the staff. I've seen your type before. Smart, quiet. The kind of woman who makes powerful men look good and gets nothing for it." He paused. "I could change that." The silence in the room stretched long enough to become something solid. "I appreciate the sentiment," Eleanor said, her voice as level as a carpenter's line. "If there's nothing else you need this evening, I have invoices to finish before morning." He stared at her for a moment. Then he smiled again. Different this time, thinner. He stood, smoothed his vest, and walked to the door. Before he left, he turned back. "You should think carefully," he said quietly, "about the value of having friends in the right places." Eleanor said nothing. She waited until she heard his footsteps fade down the corridor. Then she set down her pen and sat very still for a long time. 3 days later, Boggs approached her again. This time it was in the hotel garden just after breakfast. The early morning still cool enough to pretend the heat wasn't coming. He fell into step beside her as she was checking on a delivery of cleaning supplies, as casually as if they had arranged to meet. "I want you to dine with me this evening," he said. "Not as staff, as a guest. My guest." "That wouldn't be appropriate, Mr. Boggs." "I'm not asking what's appropriate. I'm asking what you want." He stopped walking, and she stopped too, because stopping with him felt less dangerous than turning her back. "You've spent 20 years running this hotel for men who didn't deserve the credit. I'm offering you something different. Travel, position. My operations need someone with your skills, someone I can trust, but trust goes both ways." Eleanor looked at him directly. "I think you should find those things in someone else, Mr. Boggs. I'm happy here." It was a kind lie, but it was the safest answer she knew. The look that crossed his face in that moment, just a flash there and gone, was something she had seen before, on much smaller men in much smaller moments. It was the expression of someone who had decided quietly and completely that she was going to regret this. She was right. It happened fast. That was the thing no one ever warned you about, that ruin didn't announce itself. It came suddenly and completely, like a storm that had been building on the other side of the mountains for weeks, while the sky above you remained perfectly clear. Within 48 hours, money went missing from the hotel safe. Eleanor had been the last person in the back office before the safe was found open. She knew this because Harlan Boggs told Gerald Whitmore, the hotel owner, a soft-handed man who spent most of his time in Wichita, that he had personally witnessed her entering the office very late the night before with an expression that seemed, in retrospect, suspicious. Gerald, who had never looked at Eleanor with any particular suspicion in 21 years, suddenly couldn't quite meet her eyes. "The amount is substantial," he told her, in his office, with the door closed and Harlan Boggs standing just to the side like a man who had wandered in coincidentally. "Nearly $300. "I didn't take any money," Eleanor said. "Of course," Gerald said, not looking at her. "Of course you didn't. But there's been the staff is talking, and with Mr. Boggs here as a witness, I would be willing," Boggs said smoothly, "to allow this to be handled privately. No sheriff, no public spectacle. But obviously, Eleanor's continued employment here isn't something we can—" "I didn't take any money," Eleanor said again, louder this time. The room was quiet. Gerald Whitmore looked at his desk. Harlan Boggs looked at Eleanor with an expression of such practiced sympathy that she felt something cold move through her chest. "We'll give you until this evening to collect your things," Gerald said. She should have left quietly. Later, she would wonder if that would have made any difference. But she didn't leave quietly. She walked out of that office and into the main lobby where the morning guests were finishing breakfast, where the staff she had trained for years were moving through their routines, where the flowers she had ordered sat in their vase on the reception desk. And Harlan Boggs must have already prepared for this, because before she had taken 10 steps, the talking had already begun. She heard it in fragments. $300. The safe. She was seen. It moved through the room like a lit fuse, and Eleanor stood in the middle of it and felt the ground shift beneath her feet in a way that had nothing to do with the physical earth. A woman she had trained herself, a housekeeper named Clara, sweet-natured and reliable, took a step back when Eleanor looked at her. Not dramatically, just a small step. But Eleanor saw it. That was when she understood. It wasn't just the job. He intended to take everything. She walked out of the Whitmore Grand Hotel with a carpet bag containing 3 dresses, her account ledgers from home, a small photograph, and the 43 cents she had in her coat pocket. She did not say goodbye to anyone. She did not cry. She walked down the main street of Colton Creek in the white blast of the July sun, and she kept walking until she reached the train station at the edge of town. She sat on a bench on the platform and she waited for a train that wasn't scheduled for another 4 hours, because she had nowhere else to go and she could not bear to sit in Colton Creek another moment. Around her the world continued. A man read a newspaper. 2 children chased a dog along the platform's edge. The heat shimmered off the iron rails until the tracks looked like they were melting. Eleanor Whitaker sat with her carpet bag on her lap and looked at the 43 cents in her palm and tried to think clearly. She was 52 years old. She had no family. She had no letter of reference. No man with her previous employer's goodwill was going to write one now. She had no savings to speak of because she had always been paid less than the position deserved, and she had never thought to fight about it because she had always believed that the work itself was the security. That if she was necessary enough, competent enough, irreplaceable enough, she would always have a place. She closed her hand around the 43 cents. A train screamed past without stopping. A through train, not stopping at Colton Creek, bound west. The wind from its passage hit her like a wall, whipping dust into her face, pulling at her hair. She didn't close her eyes against it. She just sat there, battered by it, and when it passed, the platform was quiet again. The woman nobody needs, she thought. That's what he's made me. She had not eaten since the previous morning. The heat pressed down on the top of her head like a physical weight. The edges of her vision had started to blur slightly in a way she recognized as dangerous. She had seen workers collapse from heat in hotel kitchens before, had known how fast it could happen when a body stopped fighting. She pressed her hand flat against the wooden bench beneath her, grounding herself, and breathed. Think. She had no letter of reference, but she had knowledge. 21 years of it. She knew supply chains and inventory systems, seasonal pricing and kitchen management, how to read a set of accounts, and know within the first 10 minutes where the money was leaking. She had survived difficult men and difficult winters and difficult boards of directors who had never once looked at her directly when they spoke about the hotel's future. She had survived all of it quietly, without credit, without complaint. What if I stopped being quiet? The thought surprised her. She turned it over carefully, the way she turned over a suspicious invoice, looking for the inconsistency, the error, the thing that didn't add up. All those years, she had believed that quiet competence was its own protection, that if she made herself indispensable enough, invisible enough, she would be safe. She had been wrong. Boggs had proven that. The moment she refused him, her invisibility had become her vulnerability. She had no name, no reputation of her own, no public standing. She was a woman who existed entirely in the service of other people's enterprises. And when those people decided she was inconvenient, she had nothing to stand behind. Never again, she thought. Whatever comes next, never again. She was still sitting with that thought when she heard footsteps on the platform behind her. She didn't look up immediately. A person learns, after long enough, to become selectively invisible in public spaces. It was a skill she had perfected over decades. But the footsteps stopped directly behind her, and when they didn't move on, she turned. The man standing there was somewhere past 50 himself, with the particular weathered quality of someone who spent most of his life outdoors, skin darkened and creased by sun, hands that looked like they'd done actual work rather than the performance of it. He wasn't especially tall, but there was a steadiness to how he stood that made the space around him feel settled. His hat was good quality but old. His eyes, she noticed, were watching her with an expression she hadn't seen directed at her in long enough that it took her a moment to identify it. Not pity, not assessment, just attention. The kind of person pays when they're actually looking at you rather than at what you represent. "You've been sitting in this heat for going on 2 hours," he said. Not unkindly, just as a fact. "I'm waiting for a train," Eleanor said. "Train's not due until 4. He glanced up at the sun, calculating. "That's another 3 hours in this. You eaten today?" She almost said yes out of reflex. She stopped herself. "No." He reached into his coat and produced a folded piece of cloth. When he held it out, she saw it contained cornbread, 2 pieces wrapped carefully. The gesture was so ordinary that something behind her sternum moved in a way she couldn't quite control. "I'm not a charity case," she said. "No," he agreed. "You don't look like one. You look like a woman who's had a bad week and hasn't eaten. Those aren't the same thing." He set the cloth on the bench beside her rather than holding it out, which she appreciated. It was less like being offered something and more like having an option. "My name is Caleb Mercer. I run a cattle operation about 12 miles south of here, the Broken Spur Ranch. I'm in town to pick up supplies." "Eleanor Whitaker," she said, because not saying her name felt worse than saying it. If he'd heard the name, if Boggs's rumors had already spread that far, that fast, nothing in his face showed it. He sat down on the bench, not too close, with the comfortable self-possession of a man not trying to be anything other than what he was. "You heading somewhere specific?" he asked. "Away from here." "Fair enough." He was quiet a moment. "I actually came over because you looked like you were about to fall off that bench," he said without drama. "He'll do that if you let it, seeing it happen to range hands half your age." "I'm not going to fall off a bench," Eleanor said, with more conviction than she entirely felt. "Probably not." He almost smiled. "But you might consider getting out of the direct sun at least." She looked at him carefully. In her experience, men who approached women sitting alone on train platforms wanted something, usually something specific, but there was nothing in Caleb Mercer's manner that felt acquisitive or threatening. There was only that same quality of simple, unadorned attention. "Why are you talking to me?" she asked bluntly. He considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Because you've been sitting in that sun for 2 hours, and nobody else seems to have noticed, and it seemed like the kind of thing a person should notice." She looked at him for another long moment. Then she picked up the cornbread. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Don't mention it." They sat in silence for a while. Eleanor ate slowly, and the food steadied the blur at the edges of her vision. The heat didn't ease. The train was still hours away. But something about sitting beside a man who asked for nothing and offered something as simple as bread and shade made the weight on her chest feel, fractionally, less like something she was going to drown under. "My ranch is short-staffed," Caleb said eventually, not looking at her. "Lost my housekeeper to marriage in the spring, and my cook quit in June. Operation side is a mess. I've got accounts nobody's properly kept in 8 months and suppliers who know it." Eleanor said nothing. "I'm not offering charity," he said. "That's not what I said. I'm saying there's work, if someone wanted it." "You don't know me," Eleanor said. "No," he agreed. "You should know that I've recently been—" She paused. "My reputation in this town is not—" "Mrs. Whitaker," Caleb Mercer said, turning to look at her directly for the first time. "I've been in Colton Creek 2 hours. In that time, I've heard 4 different versions of the same story from 4 different people, each version worse than the last. In my experience, when a story travels that fast, it's because someone needs it to." He paused. "What I see in front of me is a woman who's been sitting in 95-degree heat for 2 hours without eating, holding herself together with what looks like pure will. That tells me something about character. The other stuff tells me something too, just about different people." Eleanor looked at the iron rails shimmering in the heat. The through train had bent them into apparitions of themselves, heat ghosts of the real thing. She thought about the Whitmore Grand, about the flowers on the reception desk that she had ordered, every week for 21 years. She thought about Clara, the housekeeper, taking that small step backward. She thought about Harlan Boggs's thin smile. She thought about $300 she had never touched. "What does the work pay?" she asked. $30 a month, room and board, and I'll listen to whatever you think needs fixing. No promises past that. It was less than she'd made at the hotel. She said so. "I know," he said, "but it's honest." The word landed differently than she expected. Honest. Such a plain word. Such an ordinary thing to offer a person. And yet... "I have conditions," Eleanor said. He raised an eyebrow slightly. Not offended, just listening. "I work with full access to your accounts and supplier records. I don't make changes without explaining my reasoning. But if I tell you something needs to change, I expect to be heard. Not agreed with automatically. Heard. There's a difference." "There is," Caleb said. "And I don't need anyone on your property to like me. I need them to do their jobs. If that's going to be a problem, some of them will give you trouble," he said honestly. "I can't promise otherwise. I can promise I won't be one of them." She was quiet for a moment. In 21 years at the Whitmore Grand, no one had ever said anything remotely like that to her. "All right," she said. The 4 o'clock train could go to Wichita without her. They loaded her carpet bag into the back of his wagon beside bags of flour and salt and coiled rope. Eleanor climbed up to the seat without assistance. She had always been capable of that. And Caleb clicked the horses into motion without ceremony, turning south away from Colton Creek. She did not look back at the hotel on the horizon. She had told herself she wouldn't, and she was a woman who kept her word to herself. What she was leaving behind. The flowers on the reception desk, the pressing knowledge of her competence without credit, the morning routine she had built over 2 decades. She filed carefully away in some interior room she didn't intend to visit right now. There would be time for grief later. Grief was a luxury, and she wasn't yet in a position to afford it. What she let herself notice instead was the land opening up around her as the wagon moved south. The plains stretching in every direction under that relentless white sky, vast and hot, and oddly honest in its severity. No pretense out here, no lobby flowers, no guests with complicated demands, just the cracked earth and the heat and the road going forward. For the first time in days, she breathed fully. Beside her, Caleb drove without speaking, and she was grateful for that. She wasn't ready for conversation. She was busy with the more pressing work of deciding who she was going to be. Not the woman they'd made her, not the woman anyone had written off. Something else. She wasn't entirely sure what yet, but she had always been better at building things than at knowing what they'd look like when they were finished. The wagon rolled south through the white afternoon. The town of Colton Creek disappeared behind them. Eleanor Whitaker looked at the horizon and started to plan. The Broken Spur Ranch announced itself before they arrived. A smell of cattle and dry grass and something like iron in the air that Eleanor recognized as the particular scent of a working property under stress. Not the pleasant work smell of a well-run operation, which had its own honest character, but the sharper undercurrent of something strained. She noticed it the way she noticed inconsistencies in a hotel ledger. Not consciously at first, just a small wrongness that snagged at the edge of her attention. The ranch itself was larger than she'd expected. The main house was solid but weathered, a 2-story structure that had once been painted white and was now the color of an old bone. Behind it spread a collection of outbuildings: barn, bunkhouse, tool shed, what looked like a smokehouse. And beyond those, cattle pens that stretched further than she could easily see in the late afternoon haze. Fencing ran in long parallel lines toward the horizon. A windmill stood motionless against the sky, its blades perfectly still in the dead air. Caleb pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the main house and set the brake. A man came around the side of the barn, wiping his hands on a rag that wasn't clean enough to be doing much good. He was somewhere in his late 30s, built wide through the shoulders, with a face that operated in what Eleanor immediately recognized as its default expression. A particular kind of skepticism that wasn't quite a scowl, but was preparing for one. He looked at the wagon. He looked at Caleb. Then he looked at Eleanor, and the not-quite scowl became something more committed. "Tom," Caleb said, climbing down, "this is Mrs. Eleanor Whitaker. She's going to be taking over the operations side. Accounts, supplies, household. Give her whatever she asks for." Tom looked at Eleanor for a long moment. She coming from Colton Creek? She is. Another long moment. I see. Good, Caleb said pleasantly, and the pleasantness had a faint iron quality to it that Eleanor noted with approval. Help get her bag inside. Tom did it. He wasn't gracious about it, but he did it. Eleanor climbed down from the wagon unassisted, straightened her coat despite the heat, and looked at the ranch with the practiced eye of someone who has spent a career assessing properties. The windmill not turning was the first thing. The fence line along the east side had two sections that sagged visibly from where she stood. The water trough nearest the barn had a green rim that suggested it hadn't been scrubbed recently. None of these were catastrophic observations. Together, they told a story about a property operating slightly below the standard of attention it required. She turned to find Caleb watching her. You're already making a list, he said. I'm always making a list, she replied. Something almost like amusement crossed his face. He led her inside. The interior of the main house confirmed her assessment. It was clean in the basic sense, no obvious filth, but it had the particular disorder of a place managed by people who knew where everything was, and therefore didn't notice that nothing was organized. Papers stacked on the kitchen table. Invoices mixed with personal correspondence. A row of pegs by the door where hats and coats hung in no discernible system. The kind of disorder that had accumulated gradually, each individual addition seeming reasonable at the time, the whole effect invisible to people inside it. Eleanor set her carpet bag at the bottom of the stairs and asked to see the accounts. Caleb blinked. You just arrived. I know. The accounts, please. He brought them out, 3 ledger books and a wooden box containing loose receipts, some of them clearly from several years ago. Eleanor sat down at the kitchen table, moved the stacked papers to one side, and opened the first ledger. She read in silence for 40 minutes while Caleb made coffee. He set a cup beside her without comment. She drank it without looking up. By the time she closed the third ledger, the light outside the windows had shifted to the long gold of late afternoon. She sat back and looked at the ceiling for a moment, organizing what she'd found. Your cattle sales are consistent, she said. That's the good news. Your expenses are not. You're paying Hendrick's Supply Company 40% above market rate for feed grain. I know the market rate because I negotiated with their competitor for 3 years at the hotel. Your farrier comes 3 times what a contract arrangement would cost you for the same work. And somewhere in the last 14 months, you've lost approximately $800 that doesn't correspond to any expense I can find in these records. Caleb had gone very still at the counter. $800? That's a conservative reading. It may be closer to $950. She paused. Do you want me to stop? No, he said quietly. I want you to keep going. I need to talk to your foreman. Tom won't like that. That's all right, Eleanor said. I don't need him to like it. Tom did not like it. Eleanor interviewed him the next morning in the barn, which was his territory and where he was most comfortable, a deliberate choice on her part. People were more honest when they felt at home. She asked him about the feed orders, the farrier schedule, the ranch's relationship with its 3 main suppliers. Tom answered with the guarded brevity of a man who wasn't sure what he was being accused of and wasn't going to give any ground until he did. How long have you been buying from Hendrick's? She asked. 4 or 5 years, since before I was foreman. Do you know what the Dawson Mill charges for the same grade of grain? He looked at her steadily. Can't say I do. I'll find out, Eleanor said. It's probably significantly less. Hendrick's gives us good terms. Hendrick's gives you credit that keeps you dependent on them, Eleanor said, not unkindly. That's not the same thing as good terms. That's a trap that looks comfortable until it closes. Tom was quiet for a long moment. He was not a stupid man. She had already concluded that. But he was a man who had learned to operate within a system without questioning its foundational assumptions, because the system had been there when he arrived and he'd never had reason to pull it apart and look underneath. You planning on changing everything? He asked. I'm planning on fixing what's broken, Eleanor said, which is different. He looked at her with the same assessing skepticism she had seen the day before, and she met it without looking away, because she had been meeting that look from men for 21 years, and she was not tired of refusing to drop her eyes. I heard what they're saying about you in Colton Creek, he said, finally. I expect you did. I don't necessarily believe everything I hear. Good, she said. That's the beginning of sound judgment. Something shifted in his face. Not warmly, not yet, but a fraction of the wall came down. He picked up a halter from the hook beside him and turned back to his work, and Eleanor recognized the gesture for what it was. Not agreement exactly, but the end of active opposition. She would take it. She spent the rest of the morning walking the property. Not a social walk, a working one, systematic, the way she had once walked the hotel's every corridor every morning, touching baseboards and checking window latches. She paced the fence lines, examined the water situation, looked at the condition of the cattle in the south pasture, and compared it to the north. She asked the ranch hand she found repairing tack by the barn, a younger man named Pete, who was friendlier than Tom, a fact he seemed mildly embarrassed about, questions about the watering schedule and the rotation of pastures. "We've been using the south pasture heavy," Pete told her. "Tom says it's closer." "How long?" He thought about it. "Past 2 seasons, I think. Maybe more." Eleanor looked south. The grass out there had a different quality. Thinner, sparser. The earth between the clumps more visible than it should have been. She noted it. That evening at supper, she had taken over the kitchen that afternoon, because the cooking situation was genuinely untenable, and she did not believe in identifying a problem without solving it. She laid out what she had found for Caleb. The overgrazed south pasture. The windmill that had a loose bearing she'd found by climbing it herself, which had caused Pete to make an alarmed noise and Tom to go very quiet. The cracked wall of the water cistern on the north side that was losing water slowly but measurably into the ground. The supplier contracts that needed renegotiation. Caleb listened to all of it. He ate the food she'd made. A simple thing, beans and salt pork and cornbread, but made properly, which was its own kind of statement. And he listened, and he did not once interrupt or qualify or look at her with the expression she had seen on Gerald Whitmore's face every time she'd brought him a problem, which was the expression of a man receiving information he would have preferred not to have. "The windmill," he said when she finished. "How bad?" "I tightened the bearing as a temporary measure. It'll need a proper repair within the week." "You climbed the windmill." "It needed climbing." He looked at her for a moment. "All right," he said. "The south pasture is the one that concerns me most," she said. "You need to rotate the herd north and let the south rest for at least a full season. The grass there is compromised, and with the dry summer we're heading into—" She paused. He caught the pause. "You think the drought is going to worsen?" "The grass is doing something I've seen before. I grew up in western Missouri. My father ran a small farm. When the grass starts separating from its roots that way, pulling back from the soil surface, it means the roots are stressed from below. That doesn't happen in a single dry summer. That's deep moisture depletion." She held his gaze. "I think we have 6 weeks, maybe 8, before this becomes serious. And I think every rancher in this county is going to be looking at the same problem at the same time. Which means whoever prepares now has options. Everyone else will be in competition for the same resources later, at prices driven up by desperation." Caleb set down his fork and looked out the window at the darkening plain. He was quiet for long enough that Eleanor wondered if she had overstepped. She had a habit, she was aware, of laying out conclusions at a pace that moved faster than some people were comfortable following. "What do you need?" he said. It took her a moment to realize he was answering the question she hadn't yet asked. "Authorization to renegotiate the supply contracts," she said. "Access to market information in town, and I'd like to write to 3 ranches south of here. I know from regional reports at the hotel that they faced a similar drought 2 years ago. I want to know what they did." "Do it," Caleb said. "All of it." She wrote the letters that night by lamplight, in her room at the top of the stairs. A small room, spare, with a window that faced east. The room smelled of old pine and dry air. It was nothing like the room she'd had in her boarding house in Colton Creek, but it was hers in a way that room hadn't been in a long time. She wrote 3 letters, sealed them, and set them beside her account notes. Then she looked at the lamp for a while, listening to the night sounds of the ranch outside the window. Cattle settling, a horse shifting in the barn, the creak of the bunkhouse door. Ordinary sounds of an ordinary property. Nothing special about any of them, but she was already, in the precise way of someone assembling a mechanism, seeing how the pieces might fit differently. Better. She blew out the lamp and went to sleep more easily than she had in days. The skepticism from the ranch hands was not uniform, but it was persistent. It took forms both obvious and subtle. There was Pete, who was young enough and fair-minded enough to engage with her questions directly once he realized she wasn't there to report him for anything. There was a man named Garrett, older than Tom, who had been with the ranch for 8 years and operated on the foundational belief that women understood certain things and not others, and that the certain things definitely did not include cattle operations and financial strategy. Garrett was not mean about this belief. He held it the way some people hold geography, as simply the shape of the world not worth arguing about. Eleanor did not argue about it. She simply continued being right about things in Garrett's presence until being right became its own argument. The first concrete test came 10 days after her arrival, when the grain delivery from Hendricks arrived short, 60 pounds short of the ordered amount, at the same invoiced price as the full order. This had apparently happened before. Pete told her, offhandedly, that it happened maybe once a month, and they'd always just noted it and moved on. Eleanor went to find Tom. "I need a wagon," she said. "I'm going into town to speak with Hendricks." Tom looked at her with the expression she'd come to recognize as his version of careful neutrality. "What are you planning to say to them?" "That we received a short delivery, and we expect either a corrected delivery or a credit, and that we're moving our contract to Dawson Mill at the end of this quarter." "That'll upset the arrangement." "The arrangement is costing this ranch money," Eleanor said. "It's already upset." He was quiet for a moment. Then, surprisingly, "I'll drive you." The Hendricks conversation was not comfortable. The man behind the counter, a Mr. Silas Hendricks Jr., who had the manner of someone who had been taking advantage of an arrangement for so long he'd forgotten it was an advantage, was initially dismissive, then defensive. Then, when Eleanor produced the invoice alongside her documented market price comparison for the same grade of grain, something more cautious. "We can discuss terms," he said carefully. "I'm not here to discuss terms," Eleanor said. "I'm here to inform you of a correction. The shortfall will be made good by Thursday, or we apply it as credit to next month's order. Beyond that, we're reevaluating all our contracts at the end of the quarter." Silas Hendricks Jr. looked past her at Tom, clearly hoping for a more negotiable male presence in the room. Tom, to his credit, looked at the wall. "Mrs. Whitaker," Hendricks started, with the tone of a man about to explain something to someone who hadn't understood it. "The quantity delivered was 60 pounds short of the invoiced quantity," Eleanor said clearly. "That's a billing error. We're correcting it. Thank you for your time." On the wagon back, Tom drove for a full mile before he said anything. "He's going to complain to people," Tom said. "I know. Word'll get around that the broken spur is causing trouble." "The word that'll get around," Eleanor said, "is that the broken spur doesn't get shorted anymore. Those aren't the same thing." Another silence. Then very quietly, Tom said, "Huh." It was not a grand endorsement, but Eleanor had built most of her career on small shifts in large systems, and she recognized it for what it was. The letters she'd sent south came back within 2 weeks, each one full of exactly the information she'd hoped for. The drought she'd predicted was, according to the ranches that had lived through the last one, going to hit the water sources from the north first. The seasonal creek that fed the broken spur's north pasture would likely slow to a trickle by mid-August. She mapped the timeline carefully and brought it to Caleb with a proposal. Dig a secondary catchment pond in the east pasture now, while labor and equipment were available, to collect and hold water through the dry peak. The cost up front was real but calculable. The cost of not doing it, in cattle losses, in desperate purchases of water rights at summer prices, was significantly larger. Caleb approved it without debate, which was becoming a pattern she found herself grateful for more than she expected. The work began the following week. Eleanor coordinated it alongside her other responsibilities: the renegotiated contracts, the household management, the ongoing account reconciliation that was slowly, painstakingly untangling the source of the missing $800. She rose before the hands each morning and was the last one working each evening, not to prove anything, but because there was always more to do than the day contained. Garrett watched her coordinate the pond excavation from a distance for 2 days before he came and stood beside her at the site. "You figured the grade right," he said, looking at the shallow slope she'd calculated for maximum catchment. "I thought you'd have it wrong." "I almost did," Eleanor said honestly. "I had to recalculate twice." He was quiet for a moment. "Where'd you learn to figure drainage?" A hotel I worked at for 20 years had a drainage problem in the East Wing. I solved it because no one else was going to. She paused. I learned a lot that way. Garrett nodded slowly, chewing on that. He didn't become warm exactly, He wasn't a particularly warm man, but from that afternoon forward, when Eleanor spoke at the morning briefings Caleb had started holding at her suggestion, Garrett listened. It was 3 weeks after her arrival when the news reached the Broken Spur about Harlan Boggs. Pete brought it in from his supply run to the nearest town, a smaller settlement called Ridgeline, 8 miles east. He mentioned it casually at supper, the way people pass along information they don't entirely understand the weight of. Folks in Ridgeline saying that railroad man from Colton Creek is buying up land all through the county, Pete said. Paying low, people say. Some saying he's not exactly buying, more like pressuring. Old Larson family lost their place last week. He paused. Name of Boggs, I think. Harlan Boggs. Eleanor set down her fork. She didn't look up for a moment. She arranged the information in her mind the way she arranged numbers in a ledger, saying, carefully, without rushing, making sure each item went into its correct column. Across the table, she could feel Caleb watching her without appearing to. He's moving fast, she said finally, almost to herself. You know him? Pete asked. I know of him, she said. It was technically true. What was also true, and what she did not say at the table, was that the news of Boggs moving through the county changed the geometry of her situation in ways she was going to need to think about carefully. She had assumed that being 12 miles south of Colton Creek put her outside his immediate orbit. She was revising that assumption. After supper, when Pete and Garrett had gone to the bunkhouse and Tom was checking the horse lines, Caleb appeared in the kitchen doorway while Eleanor was washing the dishes. You want to tell me about Boggs, he said. It wasn't a question, but it wasn't a demand either. Just an opening, left there for her to take or leave. She washed the same plate twice before she answered. He was the reason I was on that platform, she said. He had me removed from my position when I wouldn't cooperate with what he wanted from me. He made sure the story that followed me was worse than the truth. Caleb was quiet. If he's buying land through this county, she said, he'll eventually look at properties with good water access and healthy cattle operations, which means he'll look at this ranch. She set the plate in the drying rack and looked at Caleb directly. You should know who I am in relation to him, in case it complicates things for you. Does it change anything you've done since you arrived? Caleb asked. No. Does it change your assessment of the drought, or the water table, or the supplier contracts? No. Then it doesn't complicate things, he said simply. But thank you for telling me. He turned to go and then stopped. Eleanor, he said, the first time he had used her given name, the $800 you're looking for in those accounts. I think you should find it, whatever it turns out to be. She looked at him. Because if Boggs is moving through this county and he gets to this ranch before we know where our own money is gone, Caleb said, that's a problem I'd rather not be surprised by. He left the doorway. Eleanor dried her hands on a cloth and stood in the quiet kitchen for a moment, listening to the ranch settle into its nighttime rhythms around her. She had arrived with 43 cents and a carpet bag and a name that had been dragged through every conversation in Colton Creek. She had arrived believing, in some place she hadn't fully admitted, that this was the last door left open to her. But standing in that kitchen, with the sound of cattle in the distance and the lamplight throwing warm shadows across the ledgers stacked at the end of the table, Eleanor Whitaker felt something she hadn't felt in longer than she wanted to calculate. Not safety. That was too simple a word, and she wasn't a woman who settled for simple words when they weren't accurate. Purpose. She pulled the accounts back toward her, sat down, and kept looking for the missing money. She found it 4 days later. It was in the feed invoices, double billing, running for 14 months, small enough each time to seem like a rounding error, large enough in aggregate to total $920. The pattern was consistent enough to be deliberate and disguised enough to require someone who knew what to look for. Eleanor recognized the technique because she had once caught a less sophisticated version of it at the hotel and had fixed it quietly, without fuss, because at that time she hadn't been the kind of woman who made accusations out loud. She was revising that policy too. She brought the documentation to Caleb the next morning. The original invoices beside the delivery records beside her calculation, everything laid out in clear sequence so there was no room for ambiguity. He looked at it for a long time. Hendricks, he said quietly. It starts 14 months ago. around the time the previous arrangement changed. She paused. Tom wouldn't have known to look for it. It was meant not to be found. Caleb stood up from the table and walked to the window. He stood there looking out at the ranch for a full minute. Eleanor waited because some things needed the minute. "All right," he said at last, and his voice was very even. "How do we handle it?" Eleanor had already written the letter to the county land office requesting the formal documentation process for a disputed commercial claim. She slid it across the table. This time, when Caleb almost smiled, it went a little further than before. Outside, the east pasture pond was taking shape in the hard earth. The cattle in the north pasture grazed on grass that was still, for now, holding its green. The windmill turned steadily in a small afternoon wind, its repaired bearing quiet and even. And 12 miles north, Harlan Boggs was moving through the county like a slow fire, buying low and pressing hard, apparently under the impression that Eleanor Whitaker had disappeared. He would discover his error. She intended to make sure of it. The letter from the county land office arrived on a Tuesday, 2 weeks after Eleanor had sent her formal documentation of Hendricks Supply Company's double billing. It was not the response she had expected. Instead of an acknowledgement of her claim, the letter informed Caleb Mercer that the Broken Spur Ranch was under preliminary investigation for irregular land use practices, specifically allegations that the ranch had been drawing water from a shared creek bed in excess of its legal allotment, to the detriment of neighboring properties. Eleanor read the letter 3 times at the kitchen table before she set it down. "Who filed it?" Caleb asked from across the table. "It doesn't name the complainant directly." She turned the letter over as though the back might say more. "But the timing is precise enough to be intentional. We file against Hendricks on a Monday. This arrives the following Tuesday." She looked at Caleb. "Boggs has someone at the land office." "You're certain?" "I'm certain of the arithmetic," she said. "Draw your own conclusion." Caleb's jaw tightened slightly. The only visible sign, she had learned, that he was genuinely angry. He was not a demonstrative man. His anger expressed itself in stillness rather than motion, which she found more credible than the other kind. "What do we need?" "Every water use record this ranch has kept for the last 5 years. Survey maps if you have them. Statements from the neighboring ranches, the ones whose water we're supposedly taking." She paused. "And I need to go to Ridgeline." "For what?" "There's a man there named Wallace Pruitt who served as county surveyor for 15 years. He retired 2 years ago. He'll know the actual water allotment records better than anyone currently at the land office, because he's the one who set them." She had learned this from the letters she'd received from the southern ranches. One of them had mentioned Pruitt's name in the context of a boundary dispute they'd resolved cleanly by going to the source rather than the bureaucracy. "If I can get his documentation, we can challenge the investigation before it formally opens." Caleb nodded once. "I'll take you tomorrow." "I need to go today," Eleanor said. "If Boggs is driving this, he won't give us the luxury of tomorrow." He looked at her for a moment, then stood and reached for his hat. "Wagon will be ready in 20 minutes. Wallace Pruitt lived in a small house at the edge of Ridgeline that was overwhelmed on 3 sides by stacked boxes of documents, surveys, maps, field notes accumulated over 15 years of county work. He was a compact, precise man in his 70s who moved through his cluttered home with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where everything was, which Eleanor found immediately reassuring. He was also, within the first 5 minutes of conversation, deeply unhappy about what she described. "Someone's filed a water complaint against the Broken Spur?" He stopped moving and looked at her sharply. "On what grounds?" "Excess draw from the creek on the northern boundary." "That's nonsense," he said flatly. "I set those allotments myself in 1881. The Broken Spur's legal draw is well within what that creek can sustain even in a dry year. Who filed it?" "The complaint doesn't name the complainant." Pruitt's eyes went sharp in a way that made Eleanor think he was considerably more alert than his age and surroundings suggested. "Anonymous complaint to the land office about water rights. Land office opens a preliminary investigation without checking the original survey records." He looked at her directly. "That's not an accident, Mrs. Whitaker. Someone is using the process as a weapon." "I know," she said. "I need the original allotment documentation." He found it in 40 minutes of searching, which, given the state of his storage, Eleanor considered impressive. He also gave her something she hadn't thought to ask for, a sworn statement, written in his precise surveyor's hand and signed, attesting to the accuracy of the original allotments and noting that no complaint regarding the broken spur's water use had ever been filed or investigated during his entire tenure as county surveyor. "You take that to the land office," he said, handing her the documents, "and you make sure the man behind the counter understands I'm available to testify in person if this goes further." "Thank you," Eleanor said. "Don't thank me," Pruitt said. "Someone's using the law as a cudgel against a working ranch. That offends me professionally and personally." He paused. "Is this connected to the railroad business?" Eleanor held his gaze. "I believe so." He was quiet for a moment. "Boggs has been through here 2 months ago, offered me money for my survey archive." His expression was dry as the summer air. I declined. On the wagon back, Eleanor organized the documents in her lap against the jolting of the road. The afternoon had gone to a flat, hazy gold, and the wind from the west had picked up slightly. Not cooling exactly, but moving, which was something after weeks of dead air. She noticed it the way she noticed everything about the weather now, with the particular attention of someone who had staked a prediction on the behavior of the sky. "He tried to buy Pruitt's records," she said. "Pruitt told you that?" "Yes." She watched the horizon. "He's been more systematic than I realized. He's not just buying land. He's eliminating the institutional knowledge that could be used against him. Pruitt's surveys, the land office. He's building a legal environment where his version of the facts is the only documented one." She paused. "He did the same thing to me. Destroyed the record of my competence before anyone could use it in my defense." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "He underestimated Pruitt." "He underestimates a lot of people," Eleanor said. "It's his most consistent weakness." They filed the counter documentation at the land office the following morning. The clerk, a young man who seemed genuinely uncertain which way the institutional wind was blowing, accepted the papers without comment. Eleanor made sure he signed the receipt. Then she wrote a letter to the county commissioner, bypassing the land office entirely, summarizing the situation and noting that a retired county surveyor with 15 years of institutional knowledge was prepared to testify that the complaint had no factual basis. She sent a copy to the editor of the Ridgeline Courier, not as a story, not yet, but as a matter of public record that she wanted documented somewhere outside the land office's filing system. Tom, who had driven to Ridgeline for supplies and witnessed her at the post office sending 4 separate envelopes to 4 separate destinations, rode home beside the wagon and said nothing for 3 miles. Then he said, "You're fighting on 4 fronts at once." 5, Eleanor said. "The Hendricks claim is still open." He was quiet again. Then, "You need any help with any of it?" She looked at him. In 6 weeks, Tom had gone from barely tolerating her presence to something she could only describe as cautious solidarity. It hadn't been a dramatic shift, no single moment of revelation. It had been the accumulated weight of watching her be right about things, consistently, without making a performance of it. "I need someone to ride to the Alcott Ranch and the Denny place," she said. "Both of them are on the same creek system. If Boggs files more complaints, he might file against them too. They should know what's happening." "I can do that," Tom said. "Today, if possible." "Today," he agreed and turned his horse off the road toward the Alcott Ranch without further discussion. It was 3 days later that the drought made its formal arrival. Eleanor had predicted 6 to 8 weeks from her initial assessment. She had been optimistic. The creek on the northern boundary, the one at the center of Boggs's fraudulent complaint, dropped to a trickle on a Wednesday morning in early August, 7 weeks after Eleanor's arrival at the broken spur. By Thursday evening, it was nearly dry. The seasonal water source that 2 neighboring ranches also depended on was failing, and the temperature, which had been extreme for weeks, climbed to levels that turned the air itself into something hostile and physical. The east pasture pond she had insisted on building held 30,000 gallons of collected water. It was not infinite, but it was enough, carefully managed, rationed with the precision Eleanor applied to all resources, to sustain the broken spur's herd through the worst of what was coming. The 2 neighboring ranches that Tom had warned were not as prepared. Eleanor went to Caleb that same Thursday evening. "The Alcott herd is going to start suffering within 2 weeks, she said. "And the Denny family has a smaller operation, but they're closer to the dry section of the creek. They may be in trouble sooner." "We don't have unlimited water," Caleb said carefully. "No, but we have more than we need if we adjust the cattle rotation." She had the numbers already because she always had the numbers. If we move 20% of our herd to the south pasture, it's recovered enough from the rest period to support them for 4 to 6 weeks. We free up capacity in the East Pond to share a controlled amount with the Alcott and Denny operations. They'd be indebted to us, Caleb said slowly. They'd be neighbors, Eleanor said. The difference matters. He considered it. What does it cost us? Labor, mostly, and the goodwill of people who will remember, come winter, that this ranch didn't leave them to dry out when we had options. She met his eyes. Boggs is isolating ranches one by one, Caleb. Individually, none of us have the standing to resist him. Together, we're a different kind of problem for him. It was the first time she had used his given name without thinking about it first. Neither of them acknowledged it, but the moment sat between them differently from the conversation before it. Do it, he said. The water-sharing arrangement brought Eleanor into direct relationship with the Alcott family, a widow named Ruth Alcott, who ran her late husband's cattle operation with her 2 adult sons, and the Dennys, a young couple in their first years of ranching who were clearly frightened by what the drought meant for everything they'd built. Eleanor visited both properties personally to explain the arrangement, the quantities, the schedule. She didn't present it as charity, she presented it as mutual resource management, which it was, and both families received it in that spirit. Ruth Alcott, who was perhaps 10 years older than Eleanor and had the manner of a woman who had survived enough to stop being impressed by difficulty, looked at Eleanor for a long moment after the explanation. "You're the woman from Colton Creek," she said. "I am," Eleanor said. "I heard the story Boggs's people put around." Ruth's gaze was direct and assessing. "I also heard you filed a water rights counterclaim that used Pruitt's original surveys, which means you got to Pruitt before Boggs could shut him up." She paused. "You're not what the story said you were." "No," Eleanor said. Ruth nodded slowly. "All right then. What do you need from us?" It was the right question, and Eleanor had come prepared to answer it. What she needed, it turned out, was exactly what both the Alcotts and the Dennys were willing to provide. Signed statements about their own water use records, witnesses to the creek's normal flow patterns over multiple years, and most importantly, a willingness to stand together if the investigation at the land office escalated. Eleanor spent 2 afternoons across the 2 properties, writing down what each family told her, organizing it into the kind of documented record that had a fighting chance against a man with money and a compromised bureaucrat. She was returning from the Denny place on a Friday evening, the sunset behind her burning the western sky to copper and rust, when she smelled it. Smoke. Not the close smoke of a cooking fire or a chimney. Something broader, with a particular bitter quality that sat at the back of the throat. The smell of grass burning, of land burning, of a fire that was not small and was not close, but was moving with the wind behind it. She stood in the wagon and looked north. The smoke column on the horizon was the color of charcoal, wide and rising fast, leaning south with the wind. The same wind she had noticed 3 days ago beginning to build from the northwest. Dry, steady, the kind of wind that turned a grass fire from a manageable event into a catastrophe. She didn't stop to think. She turned the horse and drove hard. By the time she reached the broken spur, she could see the glow. It was still miles away, but it was visible. An orange line along the north horizon, low and spreading. Caleb was already outside, standing with Tom and Garrett and Pete, all of them looking north with the focused, careful stillness of men who knew what they were seeing. "How far?" Eleanor asked, climbing down from the wagon. 8 miles, maybe, Tom said, moving south. "Wind's been steady from the northwest all day," Garrett said. "If it holds, it'll be here by midnight," Caleb said quietly. "Maybe sooner." He turned to give orders, moved the cattle, wet down the barn roof, clear the brush line along the eastern fence, and Eleanor was already thinking ahead of the orders, running the sequence in her mind the way she had once run a hotel through a crisis, which was to say quickly and in parallel rather than one step at a time. "The cattle need to go to the south pasture and east, away from the fire line," she said. "All hands on the herd first. Once they're moving, 3 people stay to wet the structures down." She was already moving toward the barn. "Pete, how much water do we have in the East Pond right now?" "Maybe 22,000 gallons, Pete said, jogging to keep up. "After what we shared with the Alcotts, it'll be enough if we're careful." She turned to Caleb. Do the Alcotts and Dennis know about the fire? He stopped. Something crossed his face. The recognition that in the urgency of the immediate, he had not yet thought 2 steps ahead. No, he said. Someone needs to ride to both properties. Tonight. I'll go, Tom said immediately. Take the bay, Caleb told him. She's fastest. He turned to Eleanor, and it was a turn with intention, a man handing something over deliberately. What else? What happened in the next 4 hours was the most sustained act of leadership Eleanor Whitaker had ever performed, and she performed it without a title, without authority that anyone had formally granted her, and without once raising her voice above the level the situation required. She directed Pete and Garrett through the water distribution, prioritizing the barn, the bunkhouse, the equipment shed in that order, wetting the roof lines and the wooden walls with the ranch's pump system in steady rotation. She sent the youngest hand, a boy of 17 named Dix, to ride the southern fence line and confirm the cattle were moving cleanly away from the north. She renegotiated the plan 3 times as conditions changed. When the wind shifted 5 degrees east, she recalculated the fire's likely approach angle and moved the cattle rotation accordingly. When the pump on the north side coughed and stalled, she identified the airlock in the line from memory of a similar problem at the hotel and cleared it in under 10 minutes while Pete held the lantern. Caleb was with the herd for the first 2 hours, pushing the cattle south with Dix, keeping the movement from becoming a panic stampede. The difference between cattle moving purposefully and cattle moving in fear was the difference between a manageable night and a disaster, and he was better at that particular task than anyone else on the property. Eleanor knew this and made decisions accordingly. At just past 10 o'clock, one of the east fence posts caught a flying ember and started to burn. Garrett saw it first and called out. Eleanor was there in 3 minutes with a bucket and the presence of mind to drench the surrounding grass in a wide circle before touching the post itself, because a burning post was manageable, but burning grass along a fence line in this wind was not. She was still standing with the empty bucket when she heard the sound, not the fire, which had its own low roar on the northern air, but something else, something closer. Caleb's voice, sharp and brief, from the north pasture, and then the sound she had been afraid of all evening, a horse screaming, and then nothing. She ran. He was on the ground near the north gate, the horse standing 3 feet away, trembling and unhurt, the gate itself half open. The ground there was uneven in the dark, and the horse had shied at a burning piece of debris that had blown ahead of the main fire, and Caleb had come off at the wrong angle onto the hard earth. He was conscious but not fully present, the particular dazed quality of a man whose head had met the ground with force. He was trying to get up, managing only to get one arm under himself before the effort faltered. "Stop," Eleanor said, kneeling beside him. "Don't try to stand yet." "The herd, Dix has the herd. They're south and moving." She put her hand on his shoulder, keeping him from the attempt. "You've hit your head. You need to stay down." "Eleanor." "Caleb." Her voice was steady. She made it steady on purpose, the way she had once made her voice steady in a kitchen fire and a burst pipe in a lobby full of panicking guests, because the first thing a crisis needed was a voice that didn't waver. "I have the ranch. Do you understand me? I have it. You stay down and let your head clear." He looked at her for a moment, a long moment, with the fire's glow reddening the air above the north tree line, and then he let himself be still. "All right," he said. She was back on her feet in seconds, directing Garrett to stay with Caleb, reclaiming the operations of a ranch whose owner was down, doing it the way she had always done the hardest things. Without announcement, without hesitation, with the simple authority of someone who understood what needed to happen and was prepared to make it happen. The fire reached the north boundary of the broken spur at 11:30. It was large, the largest Eleanor had ever seen outside of a newspaper description. A wall of orange and black moving through the dry grass with a sound like a continuous slow tearing of the earth. The fire break she had ordered cut along the northern fence line 3 weeks ago, a 10-foot strip of cleared ground that had seemed excessive at the time and that Tom had executed without enthusiasm but with thoroughness, stopped it at the fence. Not entirely. 2 sections caught, and Eleanor had people on both within minutes, beating the grass fires back with wet sacking in the heat that pressed against them like a physical force. Garrett took a burn on his left forearm that would blister badly. Pete lost his eyebrows. Eleanor's coat caught a spark and she slapped it out without breaking stride. By 2 in the morning, The main fire had turned east, following the wind shift she had tracked all evening, and the broken spur stood. The barn was untouched. The bunkhouse was untouched. The cattle were south and accounted for. The east pond, the pond she had insisted on digging before anyone had understood why, still held 14,000 gallons. Tom came back at 3 in the morning with Ruth Alcott's eldest son, James, who had ridden ahead of his family's fire situation to ask for help. Eleanor already had Pete ready with 200 gallons in barrels loaded on the secondary wagon. James Alcott looked at Eleanor with an expression that contained several things at once: gratitude, disbelief, and something that looked like the beginning of a reassessment of everything he thought he knew about the situation at the Broken Spur. "My mother said to tell you," he said, "that she'd like to speak with you when this is over, about the land office matter and some other things." "Tell her I'll come Tuesday," Eleanor said, "if the roads are clear." He nodded and turned back with the water. Caleb was sitting up by then, against the fence post near the house, his head clearer and his expression carrying the particular frustration of a capable man who had been made temporarily dependent by circumstance. Eleanor brought him water and sat beside him on the ground without ceremony. There was no ceremony left in either of them at 3 in the morning, with smoke still on the air. "Report," he said. "Ranch is intact. Herd is intact. Garrett has a burn on his arm, needs proper dressing in the morning. We lost about 40 feet of north fence line and 2 gate posts. The fire break held." She paused. "We sent water to the Alcotts. Tom's back. The Denny place was south enough to be safe." He was quiet for a moment, then, "The fire break. That was your idea." 3 weeks ago, yes. "I thought you were being cautious." "I was being accurate," she said. He turned and looked at her directly. In the dark, and the smoke, and the orange glow still dying on the northern sky. It was not a simple look. It carried the weight of the evening and the weeks before it, of a woman who had arrived with 43 cents and rebuilt the financial logic of his ranch, and predicted the drought, and cut the fire break, and run a 5-front operational crisis while he was lying on the ground, and had done all of it without asking anyone's permission or their approval. "Thank you," he said. Simply, completely, without qualification. Eleanor looked at the dying glow on the horizon. 21 years at the Whitmore Grand, and Gerald Whitmore had never once said those 2 words to her with that specific weight behind them. "Don't mention it," she said, which was what he had said to her on the train platform about the cornbread, and she said it the same way he had, meaning the opposite. A long silence held between them, filled with the sounds of a ranch cooling down from its crisis. The cattle settling in the south pasture, the creak of the barn in the wind, Pete somewhere in the darkness with a lantern doing the last check of the fence line. Then, into that silence, Garrett appeared with the look of a man carrying more news. "Ryder came in while you were at the north fence," he said, looking at Eleanor rather than Caleb, which was its own statement about how the evening had reorganized the ranch's understanding of its own command structure. "From Ridgeline. Says there's a county meeting called for next Saturday. Boggs has called it. Wants to address." Garrett paused, reading from the note in his hand. "Concerns about land misuse and water fraud in the region." Eleanor felt the shift in the air that had nothing to do with the wind. "He knows about the Pruitt documentation," she said. "He's moving first," Caleb said from the ground, "before the land office makes a ruling." "He's going to make the accusation publicly," Eleanor said, "in front of the entire county, before we have the chance to present our evidence through proper channels." She looked at Garrett. "How many ranches are invited to this meeting?" Garrett looked at the note. "Sounds like the whole county. Notice is going to every property. He's calling it a community meeting about the integrity of regional water rights." Eleanor stood up from the ground, brushing ash from her coat. The fire was out. The ranch was intact. Caleb would be on his feet by morning. The Alcotts and the Dennis were neighbors rather than strangers now, connected by the kind of shared difficulty that meant something in this country. And Harlan Boggs, 12 miles north, had just made the mistake of bringing the fight into the open. She had spent 21 years being quiet. She had spent 6 weeks proving, on a property nobody had believed in her, that silence was a strategy and not a limitation. Saturday was 6 days away. Eleanor Whitaker went to the kitchen, lit the lamp, and started to write. She wrote until 4 in the morning. Not letters this time. She had moved past letters. What she wrote was a document, careful and sequential, the kind of thing she had once wished someone had prepared for her when she was standing in Gerald Whitmore's office with no ground beneath her feet. It was a complete account, organized into sections the way a ledger was organized. Facts in one column, documentation in the other. The gap between what Harlan Boggs had claimed and what the records actually showed made visible in the space between them. She wrote what he had done at the Whitmore Grand. She wrote what he had done to the Hendricks billing arrangement. She wrote what he had done at the land office. She wrote the names of the Larson family, who had lost their property the previous month under circumstances that now, in context, had a different shape than they had in isolation. She wrote Wallace Pruitt's statement in full and cited the original survey documentation beside it. She wrote the $920 of fraudulent billing, transaction by transaction, date by date, with the corresponding delivery records that proved the discrepancy. When she was finished, she had 11 pages. She read them through twice, corrected 2 figures, and then sat back and looked at the lamp. The thing about the truth Eleanor had learned over 52 years was that it rarely announced itself dramatically. It sat in ledger columns and delivery records and dates that didn't match the stories built around them. It waited, patient and unspectacular, for someone willing to do the unglamorous work of assembling it into a shape other people could see. She had always been good at that work. She had spent 21 years doing it in service of men who collected the credit. On Saturday, she intended to do it in service of something else. She blew out the lamp and went to sleep for 3 hours. The 6 days between the fire and the county meeting moved with the particular intensity of a week that knows it is building toward something. Caleb was back on his feet by the second morning, as she had expected. He had the constitution of a man who didn't permit himself extended inconvenience, with a bruised shoulder and a persistent headache that he declined to mention and that she tracked by the slight tightening around his eyes when the light was strong. She said nothing about it. She simply moved the afternoon planning conversations to the shaded side of the barn without explaining why, and he accepted this without comment, which was the particular language they had developed over weeks of working alongside each other. Tom rode out to 4 other ranches in the county in the first 3 days, not as Eleanor's messenger, she was careful about that, but as a neighbor passing word about the Pruitt documentation and the fraudulent land office complaint. Ruth Alcott did the same from her end, with the particular efficiency of a woman who had been part of this community for 30 years and knew exactly which conversations to have with which people. By Thursday, Eleanor had received 3 more written statements from ranchers who had experienced Boggs's pressure tactics directly, 2 who had signed over parcels of land under arrangements they now understood to have been misrepresented, and 1 who had refused and subsequently found his supply credit mysteriously dried up across every merchant in Ridgeline. She added them to the document. 14 pages now, then 16. Caleb read the complete document on Thursday evening, sitting at the kitchen table while Eleanor made coffee. He read it the way he did everything, slowly, with full attention, not moving ahead until he had settled what was behind him. When he finished, he set it down and looked at the wall for a long moment. "You're going to read this at the meeting," he said. "Not all of it, selections. The rest I'll have available as documentation for anyone who wants to examine it afterward." "Boggs will try to stop you." "He can try," Eleanor said. "It's a public meeting. He called it himself, which means he can't very well have someone removed for speaking. He'll attack your character in front of everyone." "Yes," she said. "You're prepared for that." She brought the coffee to the table and sat down across from him. "I've been prepared for that since the day I walked out of the Whitmore Grand. The difference is that this time I have 16 pages of documentation and 3 retired ranchers willing to stand up and confirm what I've written." She paused. "He's going to make it personal. I intend to make it factual. Those are 2 different kinds of fights, and only one of them can be won with the truth." Caleb looked at her steadily. "I'll be there." "I know," she said. "Tom will be there. Garrett, the Alcotts, the Denneys." "I know that too." "I'm not saying it to reassure you," he said carefully. "I'm saying it because you've been fighting this ranch's battles for 6 weeks, and I want you to know that on Saturday we fight yours." The directness of it moved through her like something physical, not painfully, more the way a window opened into a room that had been shut for too long. She looked at her coffee. "Thank you," she said. The same 2 words she had said to him after the fire, with the same specific weight. They left for Ridgeline before dawn on Saturday. The community meeting was held in the Ridgeline Grain Hall, the largest indoor space in the county. A long building with raw wooden walls and a plank floor that smelled of sawdust and old harvests. By the time Eleanor arrived with Caleb, Tom, and Garrett, the hall was already half full. Farmers and ranchers and merchants and their families, filling the benches in the particular combination of curiosity and apprehension that characterized a community that knew something significant was about to happen, but wasn't yet certain what. Eleanor walked in and felt the room register her presence the way a room registers a disruption in its expected pattern. She was known here, or known of, in the way that Boggs's story had made her known, which was a version of herself she had spent 6 weeks disproving on 12 acres of frontier ranch. She felt the looks, and she did not alter her pace or her expression, because altering either would have confirmed a story she was here to correct. She took a seat near the front, on the left side, with a clear line to the speaking floor. She set her document on her knee and folded her hands over it and waited. Harlan Boggs arrived 20 minutes later with 2 associates and the practiced entrance of a man who expected rooms to rearrange themselves around him. He was dressed impeccably. The expensive vest, the spotless boots, the hat that cost more than a month of Eleanor's wages. He moved through the space with the ease of someone who had never in his life entered a room uncertain of his welcome. He saw Eleanor. His pace didn't break. His expression didn't change. But something behind his eyes went flat and deliberate in a way she recognized. The look of a man recalculating. She held his gaze for exactly 1 second. Then she looked at the front of the room, because she had said what she needed to say with that second, and prolonging it would have been theater rather than statement. The county commissioner, a heavy-set man named Harold Briggs, who had the look of someone wishing he were somewhere else, called the meeting to order with less authority than the gavel in his hand suggested he possessed. He introduced Boggs as the meeting's convener, cited the stated purpose, discussion of regional water rights and land use concerns, and sat down with visible relief at no longer being the person standing at the front. Boggs spoke for 15 minutes. Eleanor listened to every word with the precision of someone taking inventory, because that was exactly what she was doing. He was accomplished at this. She had known he would be. His voice was measured and reasonable, his tone that of a concerned regional stakeholder with no personal interest beyond the community's welfare. He discussed water rights as a collective resource, expressed concern about certain ranches drawing more than their legal allotment during the current drought, mentioned the ongoing land office investigation as evidence that these concerns had institutional merit, and referred briefly but pointedly to the importance of personal character in those entrusted with managing shared regional resources. He didn't say her name during that first speech. He didn't need to. Half the room was already looking at Eleanor, and the half that wasn't was pretending not to. When Boggs finished and opened the floor, Eleanor stood up. The room went quiet in the particular way that happens when the thing everyone was waiting for actually arrives. "My name is Eleanor Whitaker," she said. Her voice carried clearly. She had spent decades projecting calm authority into rooms that weren't inclined to give it to her, and her voice was the most reliable tool she had. "I manage operations at the Broken Spur Ranch, 12 miles south of Colton Creek. I'd like to respond to several of Mr. Boggs's points, if the commissioner will allow." Harold Briggs looked at Boggs. Boggs spread his hands in a gesture of gracious permission that was calculated to make any objection seem petty. "The floor recognizes Mrs. Whitaker," Briggs said. She opened the document on her knee. The land office investigation Mr. Boggs referenced was initiated 9 days ago, the day after the Broken Spur Ranch filed a formal claim against Hendrick's Supply Company for fraudulent billing. I would like to submit for the record a sworn statement from Wallace Pruitt, who served as county surveyor for 15 years and set the original water allotments for every ranch on this creek system, attesting that the Broken Spur's water use has never exceeded its legal allotment, and that no complaint of water misuse was ever filed or investigated during his entire tenure. She paused and looked up. The room was very still. "I would also like to note," she continued, "that Mr. Boggs approached Mr. Pruitt 2 months ago with an offer to purchase his survey archive. Mr. Pruitt declined." She let that sit for precisely the right number of seconds. The sequence of events, our filing against Hendricks, the immediate land office complaint, the attempt to acquire the documentation that would disprove that complaint, suggests a pattern of using institutional processes as a mechanism of business pressure rather than a good faith pursuit of community welfare. Boggs's voice came from behind her, smooth and unruffled. Mrs. Whitaker is a woman who was removed from her previous position under circumstances that— I'm aware of the story, Eleanor said, without turning around. She kept her eyes on the room, on the faces watching her, the farmers and ranchers and merchants who had come here to understand something and were now in the process of understanding something different than what they'd expected. Mr. Boggs constructed that story after I refused a personal proposition he made at the Whitmore Grand Hotel in Colton Creek. I have no documentation of that refusal because it occurred in private, and I will not ask this room to take my word for it. She paused. What I will ask this room to examine is the documented record, which does not require anyone's word. She turned the page. Hendrick's Supply Company has been double billing the Broken Spur Ranch for 14 months. The discrepancy totals $920. The invoice records and delivery documentation are in this packet, available for examination by anyone in this room. She held it up. Hendrick's Supply Company's owner, Silas Hendricks, has business ties to the Western Continental Railroad that are documented in the county business registry. I did not discover this connection until after I had already identified the billing fraud. I will let the room draw its own conclusion about its significance. A sound moved through the hall, not quite a murmur, more the collective intake of breath that precedes one. Furthermore, Eleanor said, I have received statements from 3 property owners in this county who signed land agreements with Western Continental Railroad representatives under conditions they have now described, in writing, as misrepresentation. Those statements are also in this packet. The Larson family, whose property changed hands last month, is represented among them. Somewhere near the back of the room, a woman made a sound that wasn't quite a word. Eleanor recognized the quality of it, the sound of someone who has been waiting to hear their own experience named out loud. Boggs stood. He was controlled, but something in his control had a different quality now, tighter, less comfortable. Commissioner Briggs, I have to object to this woman being permitted to make unsubstantiated— The statements are signed and dated, Eleanor said clearly, looking at Briggs rather than Boggs. They are substantiated. That is the definition of a sworn statement. She's a disgraced employee with a personal vendetta. I'm a woman with a ledger, Eleanor said, and her voice was so calm and so precise that the room heard the contrast with his clearly. If the ledger is wrong, I invite anyone present to examine it and identify the error. That's all I've asked for since the night I was accused of theft in Colton Creek. The opportunity for someone to look at the actual record rather than the story built around it. Briggs was gripping his gavel without using it. The room had reorganized itself. Eleanor could feel it, the way she could feel the reorganization of a room she was managing, the subtle collective shift of people deciding where they stood. Ruth Alcott stood up from her bench on the right side of the hall. She was a large-framed woman who stood with the settled permanence of someone who had been on the same land for 3 decades and intended to remain. I'd like to say something, she said, in a voice that made the statement a fact rather than a request. Briggs nodded. My ranch draws from the same creek as the Broken Spur, Ruth said. My water use records go back to 1879. Not once in 15 years have I seen that ranch draw more than its allotment. Not once. She looked at Boggs with the particular directness of a woman who has buried a husband and survived a drought and has no remaining patience for theater. What I have seen in the last 3 months is 3 of my neighbors pressured into deals they didn't fully understand by men representing the Western Continental Railroad. She paused. I've seen it because 2 of those neighbors came to me afterward, embarrassed and frightened and not sure what to do. She sat down with the finality of someone who had said what needed saying. A man near the middle of the room, Eleanor didn't know him, a farmer by the look of his hands, said loudly, The Larsons got 3 months to vacate. 3 months, after 40 years on that land. That's a private business matter, one of Boggs's associates started. It's my neighbor's matter, the farmer said, which makes it my business. The hall had changed. Eleanor could hear it in the quality of the silence between the voices. The shift from uncertain assembly to something more cohesive, the collective movement of people who had individually felt something wrong and were discovering in this room that they were not alone in that feeling. It was a fragile thing, this shift. She had seen it in smaller rooms over smaller stakes, and she knew how quickly it could fragment if the wrong thing was said next. She spoke before the moment could dissolve. I'm not asking this room to take any action today, she said clearly so that everyone could hear. I'm not asking for a judgment or a vote. I'm asking for one thing, that the documentation in this packet be placed in a location where any resident of this county can examine it. Not in the land office, which has already demonstrated its susceptibility to outside pressure, but with the county commissioner's office directly as a matter of public record. She turned to look at Harold Briggs, who had the expression of a man who had come to this meeting expecting to watch someone else have a difficult afternoon and was now discovering that he was part of it. Commissioner Briggs, will you accept this documentation? Briggs looked at Boggs. Then he looked at the room. The room was looking at him, which was its own kind of answer. I will, he said. He said it quietly, but he said it. Eleanor walked to the front of the room and placed the 16-page document on the table in front of Harold Briggs. As she set it down, she heard the sound the room made. Not applause, nothing so theatrical as that. Just the collective release of held breath, the sound of a pressure equalized. She turned around. The hall was full of faces she didn't know, people who had come in uncertain and were leaving with the particular expression of those who have been handed information they will spend the next several days reorganizing their understanding around. Tom was standing near the back wall, arms crossed, with an expression she had never seen on him before, something between pride and the slight discomfort of a man who is revising opinions he has held for some time. Garrett was beside him, looking at the floor, which for Garrett was the equivalent of a standing ovation. Pete, who had ridden in from the ranch to attend, was openly watching Boggs with the unguarded curiosity of a young man watching something he would describe to people for years. Caleb was seated 3 rows back, watching her with the steady attention he had turned on her since a train platform in July. The look that had nothing acquisitive in it, that asked nothing, that simply saw. Boggs had not moved from his position at the side of the room. His associates were talking quietly to him, but he was not looking at them. He was looking at Eleanor, and for the first time since she had known him by reputation and by experience, Harlan Boggs looked like a man standing on ground that had changed underneath him without his permission. She met his eyes. She'd held them for exactly as long as she had held them in the grain hall doorway. 1 second, deliberate and complete. Then she turned and walked to her seat. The meeting did not end dramatically. Harold Briggs, clearly grateful for any procedural handhold, called for a brief recess and then a return to order, during which several more ranchers made statements of varying coherence and emotion. Boggs's associates attempted a rebuttal that focused heavily on Eleanor's dismissal from the Whitmore Grand and found increasingly little purchase with an audience that had just watched her present 16 pages of organized documentation with the composure of someone who had nothing to hide. By 3 p.m, the official business was concluded and the hall was emptying in clusters of 2s and 3s, the conversations that mattered moving into the street and the yard and the long ride home to ranch houses and farmsteads across the county. 3 different people stopped Eleanor before she reached the door. A rancher named Joseph Carver, whose spread was north of the Alcotts, said he had a billing dispute with a vendor he'd never been able to explain and asked if she'd be willing to look at his records. A woman named Dorothea Webb, the wife of a merchant in Ridgeline, said her husband had been pressured by Boggs's men in ways she'd been afraid to say out loud until today, and she squeezed Eleanor's hand with a grip that communicated everything that words hadn't gotten to yet. A young woman barely out of her teens, who gave only her first name, Harriet, said nothing coherent at all, just looked at Eleanor with an expression of such concentrated attention that it wasn't until later, riding home in the wagon, that Eleanor understood what she'd been looking at. She had been looking at a possibility she hadn't known was possible. The ride home was quiet in the way of people who have been in a sustained state of alertness and are beginning to come down from it. The plains ran gold and dry in the late afternoon, the sky above them that same whitish blue that had been building all summer, the heat finally, fractionally, beginning to ease towards something the body could tolerate without effort. Caleb drove. Tom and Garrett rode behind the wagon. Eleanor sat with the empty space on her knee where the document had been and looked at the horizon. You knew he'd try to make it personal, Caleb said after a while. He always does, Eleanor said. It's the only leverage he knows how to use. When the facts are against you, you attack the character of the person presenting them. She paused. It works, most of the time. It worked in Colton Creek. It would have worked today too if there hadn't been a room full of people who had their own experience of him to compare the story against. Briggs accepted the documentation.
He did. She was quiet for a moment. That doesn't end it. Boggs has money and patience and people in places that matter. This is a day that shifts the ground, not a day that finishes the fight. She said it honestly because she had never believed in easy endings and had learned to distrust the comfort of premature relief. But the ground has shifted. Tom rode up alongside the wagon. Carver wants to join any action against the land office. I know, Eleanor said. Tell him I'll write to him next week.
The Alcott boy, James, says his mother wants a meeting at her place. Says she has more to tell you than she could say in a hall with Boggs's men in the room. Tuesday, Eleanor said. I told her I'd come Tuesday. Tom nodded and fell back. Beside her, Caleb had the expression she had come to associate with him processing something at depth. After today, he said, choosing his words with his characteristic care, people are going to come to you, not just about Boggs, about other things, problems they don't know how to solve, women especially, I think. Eleanor looked at him. I'm not telling you what to do with that, he said quickly. I'm saying I've seen it happen when someone breaks something open in a community. People don't just bring the one problem, they bring everything they've been carrying. She looked back at the horizon. The last of the afternoon light was doing something extraordinary to the dry grass, turning it amber, then copper, then a deep gold that made the scorched sections and the surviving sections alike look valuable. The land had been through fire and drought, and a summer that had pressed down on it with extraordinary cruelty, and it was still here. Different, maybe. Changed in ways that wouldn't entirely heal, but still here, and in the low gold light, still beautiful. I know, she said. It was the answer to several questions he hadn't asked, and she knew he understood that. They reached the broken spur as the last light left the sky. The cattle were quiet in the south pasture. The barn stood solid and untouched. The east pond, still holding its 14,000 gallons, caught the first stars. The windmill turned steadily in the evening air, its repaired bearing smooth and even, the sound of it barely audible. The sound of a thing working correctly, which was, Eleanor had always thought, the most satisfying sound in the world. She climbed down from the wagon and stood in the yard for a moment before going inside. The night air was cooler than it had been in weeks. Not cold, not yet, but carrying the first hint of eventual autumn in its undertone. The smell of the land after fire and drought had its own particular quality, something between char and earth and the persistent green of things that refused to die. She was 52 years old. She was standing in a ranch yard in Kansas with soot on her coat and 16 pages of documentation just filed as public record, and a room full of people who had, today, seen her clearly for the first time. She had 43 cents to her name when she arrived here, and what she had now was not money, not yet, but something that money, at its best, was only ever a proxy for. Standing. Her own, earned, documented, undeniable standing, not borrowed from someone else's enterprise, not invisible in someone else's success, but built from her own two hands and her own 21 years of knowledge and her own refusal, on a sweltering train platform in July, to disappear quietly. She heard the screen door open behind her and knew, without turning, that it was Caleb, come to stand in the yard the way he did sometimes in the evenings, looking at his property with the uncomplicated appreciation of a man who understood what he had. Garrett's asking about supper, he said. There's a pot of beans from this morning, Eleanor said. Tell him it'll be 20 minutes. She went inside. She lit the lamp. She put the beans on to heat and sliced the bread and set the table with the straightforward competence of a woman who did not need grand moments when the ordinary ones were available. But somewhere in the stack of account ledgers at the end of the table, placed there by her own hand, was a blank journal she had bought in Ridgeline 3 weeks ago. She had known, even then, that she was going to need it eventually. She had begun to understand, in a way she was only starting to articulate even to herself, that what she had done for the broken spur, the systems, the documentation, the organized knowledge of how a working operation survived, was not specific to this ranch. It was not even specific to ranches. It was specific to women who knew things that no one had thought to ask them. Harriet's face in the grain hall, Dorothea Webb's grip on her hand, Ruth Alcott's voice, steady and clear in the silence. What I have seen is 3 of my neighbors pressured into deals they didn't understand. Eleanor put the blank journal on top of the ledgers and looked at it while the beans heated on the stove. She was 52 years old. She had just filed 16 pages of documented truth against a man who had tried to erase her. She had run a ranch through drought and fire and institutional sabotage and had come out the other side with the property intact, the neighbors intact, and the first real fracture in Harlan Boggs's armor of untouchability. She was not finished. She understood this completely, without drama, the way she understood everything, as a fact to be organized and acted upon. The beans came to a simmer. She stirred them once, set the lid, and opened the blank journal to the first page. She picked up her pen, and she began. The blank journal did not stay blank for long. By the end of that first evening, Eleanor had filled 4 pages, not with grand plans or declarations, but with the same organized precision she brought to everything. Names in one column, situations in the other. What each person had described to her, what documentation they likely had, what they would need to know in order to understand their own position clearly. Harriet, the young woman from the grain hall whose last name she still didn't know. Dorothea Webb and her husband's merchant pressures. The Larson family, who had vacated their property and were somewhere she hadn't yet located. 3 other women mentioned in passing by Ruth Alcott, widows, daughters of ranchers, women managing operations that didn't belong to them on paper and never would. It was not, at this stage, anything as formal as a plan. It was more the way a foundation looks before the walls go up, recognizable only to someone who already knows what the finished structure is supposed to be. The weeks following the county meeting moved with the particular quality of an aftermath, slower on the surface than the events that preceded it, but denser underneath, full of consequences working their way through systems at their own pace. The land office investigation against the broken spur was formally closed 11 days after the meeting, citing insufficient evidentiary basis. Commissioner Briggs signed the closure notice himself, which Eleanor took as a sign that the documentation she had filed had done its work in the right places. The Hendricks claim moved more slowly. Commercial disputes always did. But by October, a county mediator had been appointed to review the billing records, and Silas Hendricks Jr. had stopped returning correspondence from his attorney with any apparent urgency, which Eleanor read as the behavior of a man calculating the cost of continued resistance. Harlan Boggs did not leave the county. She had expected that possibility and had not depended on it. Men like Boggs didn't retreat because the ground shifted. They recalculated and repositioned, and she had known from the grain hall that the meeting had been a blow to his momentum rather than an ending. What it had done, she believed, was change the texture of the territory he was moving through. He had operated in this county on the assumption that isolated ranches and uninformed property owners would not compare notes, would not recognize individual pressures as part of a pattern, would not find in each other the kind of collective knowledge that could be organized into something formidable. That assumption was no longer accurate. Ruth Alcott became, without either of them formally deciding it, Eleanor's primary partner in what came next. The Tuesday visit to the Alcott ranch had extended well into the evening, and what Ruth told her in the kitchen of the house she had run alone for 6 years since her husband's death was more detailed and more damaging than anything Eleanor had yet assembled. Ruth had been watching Boggs's operation since its first arrival in the county, had been collecting her own information with the methodical patience of a woman who knew that observation was the one resource that couldn't be taken from her, and had been waiting, with a frustration she expressed clearly and with considerable vocabulary, for someone who would know what to do with what she had gathered. "I've been keeping records since February," Ruth said, pushing a stack of papers across the kitchen table. "I just didn't know where to send them." Eleanor looked at the stack. It was substantial and organized with a care that suggested Ruth Alcott had a great deal in common with Eleanor Whitaker and had simply never had a comparable arena for it. "Who else knows you've been doing this?" "James knows. Nobody else." Ruth's expression was dry. "People don't generally ask what the widow is keeping track of." "No," Eleanor said. "They don't." Ruth looked at her steadily. "What are you going to do with it?" "I'm going to find a lawyer," Eleanor said. "A good one, not from this county." She found him in Wichita, a man named Arthur Crane, who had a reputation for taking on cases that involved commercial fraud, and who had, according to the rancher in the Southern correspondence who had recommended him, the particular quality of not being impressed by powerful men. Eleanor wrote to him in October with a summary of the situation and a selected portion of the documentation. He replied within 10 days, asking for a meeting. She went to Wichita on the 1st of November, alone, on the early train, the same railroad line that Boggs's company was trying to expand, which she noted with the grim appreciation of someone who recognized irony when she was sitting inside it. She met Arthur Crane in his office above a dry goods store, a lean and precise man in his 50s who read her full documentation in silence for 40 minutes while she sat across from him and did not fidget. When he finished, he set the papers down and looked at her over his spectacles. "How did you assemble all of this?" "The same way you'd assemble any accurate record," she said. "Carefully, with primary sources, and without accepting anyone's word for anything I could verify directly." He almost smiled. "The billing fraud is actionable. The land misrepresentation cases, if the Larson family will testify, and if the other two property owners will follow, give us a pattern that moves this from a single commercial dispute into something the state's commercial regulatory office will be very interested in." He paused. "The difficulty is Boggs's resources. He will hire better legal representation than you can likely afford." "I know," Eleanor said. "What I have instead of money is documentation that is more complete than what he'll expect. He's accustomed to dealing with people who weren't watching carefully. We've been watching carefully." Crane looked at her for a moment. "Who is we?" "Myself, Ruth Alcott, Wallace Pruitt, 3 ranchers with signed statements, and I am in the process of locating the Larson family." She located the Larson family in December, not through any dramatic means, but through the methodical correspondence she had established with merchants and postmasters in 4 surrounding counties, the same network she had once used to manage hotel supply chains, now redirected. Margaret Larson was staying with her sister in a town called Pratt, 60 miles east, with her husband and her 2 youngest children. The 3 older children had gone to work in various capacities to keep the family solvent. Margaret wrote back to Eleanor's letter within a week, and the letter was 3 pages long and contained everything. Eleanor read Margaret Larson's letter at the kitchen table of the Broken Spur on a cold December evening, with the lamp burning and the first real winter wind pressing against the windows, and she sat with it for a long time after she finished. Not for the information, which was exactly what she had hoped for, and more, but for the quality of the letter itself. The way Margaret Larson wrote about what had happened to her family was with the particular combination of precision and controlled fury of someone who had been waiting for someone to ask. "They told my husband the terms were standard," she wrote. "We didn't know anyone who had signed a similar agreement. We had no one to compare it against. By the time we understood what we had agreed to, the deadline had already passed." Eleanor folded the letter carefully and placed it in the growing documentation file that now occupied its own shelf in the ranch's back room. Then she wrote Margaret Larson back, not with legal advice, but with something more practical. A clear accounting of what the case looked like, what would be needed from the Larson family specifically, and what the likely timeline was. She wrote it the way she wished someone had written to her on the train platform in July, directly, with full information, treating the recipient as someone capable of handling the truth. The winter passed in the way of winters on the frontier, slowly and with its own particular demands that had nothing to do with legal cases or county politics. The ranch needed feeding and maintenance and the 100 daily decisions that kept a working property alive through cold months. Eleanor managed all of it alongside the correspondence, the documentation, the slowly building case that Arthur Crane was assembling in Wichita. She had renegotiated the ranch's supplier contracts in the fall, and the savings showed already in the winter accounts. Clean numbers, honest numbers, the kind that meant the spring would begin from a position of real stability rather than the precarious credit dependence she had walked into in July. Caleb across these months was a constant. Not dramatically, he was not a dramatic man, but in the specific way of someone who had reorganized his understanding of who was in the room with him and was proceeding accordingly. He consulted her on decisions that previously would have been his alone. He deferred to her assessments of the supplier market and the water situation and the cattle rotation with the ease of someone who had stopped feeling that deferral compromised him. He was present in the evenings when she worked late, not intrusively, but with the particular companionship of someone who found the proximity of a working person congenial. In January, he asked her to stay permanently, not as a romantic declaration. That conversation had been happening gradually, in increments,
in the language they had developed between them over 7 months of common purpose, but as a formal proposition, a partnership arrangement for the ranch, documented, with her name on the operational side as a co-manager with legal standing. "Because you've been running it since August," he said, "and it should say so on paper." "That's not traditional," she said. "No," he agreed. She looked at him for a long moment. "I'll need to think about it." "I know," he said. "Take your time." She thought about it for 3 days. Not because she was uncertain, but because she had learned the hard way what happened when significant decisions were made in the heat of circumstance rather than with clear eyes, and she intended to be certain. On the 4th day, she said yes, and they shook hands over the kitchen table like two people who had been business partners for months, and were only now getting the formality right, which was, she thought, exactly what they were. The legal proceedings against Harlan Boggs and the Western Continental Railroad formally opened in March of the following year, filed in the State Commercial Court in Wichita by Arthur Crane on behalf of 5 plaintiffs: the Broken Spur Ranch, the Alcott operation, Joseph Carver, and the Larson family, with a 5th plaintiff who came forward in February, a rancher named Samuel Drury who had been pressured into selling a water rights easement under terms he had not understood. The charges encompassed commercial fraud, misrepresentation in land and water rights transactions, and collusion with county officials. The last charge referencing a clerk at the land office who had, under questioning from the county commissioner, admitted to receiving payment from a Western Continental associate for expediting certain complaints. Boggs hired, as Arthur Crane had predicted, excellent legal representation. The case was not quick. It moved through the spring and into the summer of the following year. A full year after Eleanor had arrived at the Broken Spur with 43 cents and a carpet bag, with the grinding patience of formal legal process. Eleanor provided documentation, answered questions, sat in a Wichita courtroom twice to give testimony that she delivered with the same organized precision she had shown in the grain hall, except that this time there was a judge and a formal record and a stenographer capturing every word. The Larson family testified in April. Margaret Larson sat in the witness chair with a composure that Eleanor recognized from the inside as something built under pressure rather than natural, the kind of steadiness that costs something to maintain but is maintained anyway. She answered every question clearly and completely, and when Boggs's attorney attempted to suggest that her husband had not read the agreement carefully enough, Margaret Larson looked at him with an expression that silenced the courtroom for a full 5 seconds before she replied. "My husband read every word of that agreement, and every word of it was designed to be misunderstood." The judge instructed the jury for 2 days in June. Eleanor was not in Wichita for the verdict. She was at the Broken Spur, in the East Pasture, watching the grass come back. The previous year's drought had scarred the land in ways that were still visible: bare patches, cracked channels, the ghost lines of where the water had failed. But the spring rains had been generous, and through the scarred sections the new grass was coming up with the tenacious green of something that had survived enough to know how. She was checking the catchment pond, full now, overflowing in fact, the surplus running clean through the east channel she had designed, when she heard the horse coming hard from the direction of the road. It was Pete, riding with the particular urgency of someone carrying news that can't wait for a walk. "Telegram from Crane," he called out, pulling up. "Tom said to find you." She took the folded paper from his hand. She read it standing in the East Pasture with the late afternoon sun on her back and the smell of new grass around her. Verdict returned. Guilty on all primary counts, sentencing in 30 days. Boggs enjoined from further business activity in state pending appeal resolution. Larson land transfer voided. Congratulations. Crane. She read it twice. Then she folded it carefully along its original creases and put it in her coat pocket. Pete was watching her with barely contained excitement. "Well?" "We won," she said simply. He let out a sound that was half shout and half something less dignified, wheeled his horse, and galloped back toward the barn to tell the others. Eleanor watched him go with something moving through her chest that she allowed herself to feel fully, without qualification or rush. Harlan Boggs was convicted 3 months later on the full charges. The sentencing included fines that would take years to satisfy and a period of confinement that effectively ended his role in the Western Continental Railroad's regional operations. The railroad company itself, under pressure from the State Commercial Regulatory Office and the attendant publicity of the trial, quietly restructured its land acquisition practices and replaced two senior executives. The land office clerk who had accepted payment was removed from his position. The Larson family's property transfer was formally voided by court order, which meant in practice that the land could not simply be returned. Boggs had already sold portions of it. But the financial settlement that accompanied the voiding allowed Frank and Margaret Larson to purchase a comparable property 2 counties west and begin again. Eleanor attended the Larson family's first harvest celebration on their new property in October. She sat at a long table in a field at sunset, surrounded by the Larson family and their neighbors, eating food that tasted of genuine relief, listening to Frank Larson make a toast that wandered through several topics before arriving, with a directness that clearly cost him some pride, and that she respected for exactly that reason, at the thing he most wanted to say. "There's a woman at this table," he said, looking at Eleanor, "who put our story in a document and made sure someone with the authority to act on it actually read it. I don't have the right words for what that means to this family." He stopped. His wife put her hand over his on the table. "So, I'll just say thank you, and I'll say it in front of witnesses, so there's a record." The table laughed and Eleanor smiled, genuinely, without the calibrated warmth she had deployed for hotel guests for 21 years, but something less managed and more real. "There's a record," she confirmed. It was at this table, watching the Larson children run in the harvest field in the last of the October light, that Eleanor understood something she had been approaching for months from different angles. She had won a legal case. She had saved a ranch and then helped save several others. She had exposed a fraudulent scheme and put its architect in front of a jury of his peers. These were not small things. But what she was looking at in the Larson field was not the end of something. It was the evidence that something else was possible. Margaret Larson, across the table, was talking to a young woman Eleanor hadn't met before, one of the neighboring farm wives, 20 or so years old, with the specific look of someone whose questions have never been taken seriously by anyone with the knowledge to answer them. Margaret was talking to her the way Eleanor had talked to Margaret, and the young woman was listening the way Margaret had listened to Eleanor, with the full attention of someone receiving information they had needed for a long time. Eleanor watched this for a moment. Then she reached into her coat pocket and found the blank page she had taken to carrying, an old habit from the hotel, always paper, always a pen. And she wrote a name and an address on it. She folded it and passed it down the table to Margaret, who looked at it and looked at Eleanor. "For her," Eleanor said quietly. "When she's ready." Margaret nodded and passed it on. The Frontier Women's Resource Association, which was not what Eleanor originally called it, because she did not name it anything at all for the first 6 months, preferring to let the thing be what it was before deciding what to call it, began in the back room of the Broken Spur Ranch in the winter following Boggs's conviction. It began as correspondence, Eleanor writing to women in 3 counties who had been described to her by Ruth Alcott, by Margaret Larson, by Dorothea Webb, and the 3 Ridgeline women who had come forward after the grain hall meeting. Letters explaining how to document a billing dispute, how to request original survey records from county offices, how to identify misrepresentation in a contract compared to its stated terms. She wrote these letters the way she had once written hotel supply correspondence, precisely, practically, with no condescension and no softening of the relevant facts. She treated the recipients as adults who were fully capable of acting on accurate information if someone would only provide it to them. The responses came back transformed. Not uniformly. Some women were not in positions that allowed for action, and Eleanor understood this clearly and wrote back accordingly, with patience rather than urgency. But enough came back with a quality of directed energy that told her the thing she had suspected, that what these women lacked was not capability, but access. Access to information, access to processes, access to the kind of documented knowledge that the men around them accumulated casually through commerce and courthouse and conversation, while the women managed the operations those men depended on and were never invited into the rooms where the decisions were made. Ruth Alcott joined formally in the spring, bringing her organizational energy and her 3 decades of community relationships to what was becoming, by April, too large for Eleanor to manage alone. Dorothea Webb's husband, who had been watching his wife's involvement with the cautious skepticism of a man watching something he didn't fully understand, arrived at the Broken Spur one Tuesday morning and offered the use of his Ridgeline storefront for a regular meeting space.
Eleanor accepted without making anything of it, because the decision to accept or reject was straightforward, and the moment didn't benefit from ceremony. Harriet, whose last name Eleanor had finally learned was Cole, became the association's youngest member at 19 and its most tenacious correspondent, writing to women in counties that Eleanor hadn't yet reached with a directness and energy that reminded Eleanor of something she recognized but couldn't quite name until one afternoon when Harriet sat across from her in the back room going through correspondence with the focused attention of someone completely in their element, and Eleanor understood. She reminded her of herself at an age when she had not yet learned to make herself quiet. "You have a gift for this," Eleanor told her. Harriet looked up with the slightly surprised expression of someone unaccustomed to hearing that. "For writing letters?" "For making people feel that their situation is understandable and their options are real," Eleanor said. "Those are not the same thing as writing letters. Those are much harder." Harriet was quiet for a moment, then, "You do it too." "I learned to," Eleanor said. "You already know how." By the following years, the association had formal correspondence relationships with women in 11 counties and had assisted in the resolution of 7 documented cases: billing disputes, contract misrepresentations, property claims, and one case involving a woman whose husband's death had left her in a legal ambiguity regarding property ownership that the county had shown no urgency to clarify. That case had required a second letter to Arthur Crane, who by this point had developed a working relationship with Eleanor that operated on the practical basis of mutual respect and shared irritation at the same categories of injustice. The ranch continued alongside all of it, because the ranch was where it had started, and where Eleanor's particular competence had first found room to operate. The accounts were clean, the supplier relationships were honest, the cattle were healthy, and the East Pasture Pond had become, in its second full year of operation, the kind of infrastructure that simply existed as part of the property's character, obvious in retrospect, invisible to anyone who hadn't watched it being argued for and dug out of reluctant earth in a heat wave by a woman who had been on the property for 3 weeks. Caleb, who had watched all of it from the useful distance of a man who understood the difference between partnership and interference, said to her one evening in the second autumn, standing on the porch in the early dark with the smell of turned earth from the south pasture and the first cool of a season that was coming in gently this year, "You're going to need more than a back room soon." "I know," Eleanor said. "I've been thinking about the old equipment shed. It's solid, but we don't use it for equipment anymore." She looked at him sideways. "You'd give over your equipment shed." "It's a better use," he said simply. She looked out at the dark plains for a moment. The windmill turned steadily in the night air, its sound the particular clean rhythm of a thing repaired and running true. The cattle were quiet. The stars above the Kansas plain were extraordinary, the kind of sky that only existed at this distance from cities and complications, a sky that made the scale of things legible in a way that was, depending on your circumstances, either humbling or clarifying. For Eleanor, standing in the yard of a ranch she had arrived at with 43 cents and no expectation of being seen, it was clarifying. "All right," she said, "the equipment shed." He almost smiled, and she almost smiled back. And the night held them both in the easy way of people who have built something together over enough time that the building itself has become the fact of the matter, more real and more solid than any single moment that went into it. 3 years after Eleanor Whitaker had sat on a train platform in the July heat of 1894 and looked at 43 cents in her palm and tried to think clearly, the Frontier Women's Resource Association held its first formal assembly in Ridgeline. The converted equipment shed had become, by then, too small for the occasion, and the meeting was held instead in the grain hall, the same building where Eleanor had stood with 16 pages of documentation and made Harlan Boggs's version of the facts compete with the actual record. The hall was full, women from 14 counties, some of whom had traveled 2 days to attend. Ruth Alcott in the front row, looking like a woman who has arrived exactly where she intended to be. Margaret Larson, who had written to Eleanor the previous month to say that her daughter, 16 years old and already asking questions about land law, wanted to correspond with Harriet Cole. Harriet herself, now 22, running the correspondence operations of the association with an organized precision that had made Eleanor simultaneously proud and quietly obsolete in that particular role, which was exactly what she had hoped for. Dorothea Webb's husband, who now openly described himself to anyone who asked as a supporter of the association, had arranged for the hall's use. Wallace Pruitt, who had driven in from his document-surrounded house in Ridgeline, sat near the back with the expression of a man who had made one correct decision and was pleased to see its consequences. Eleanor stood at the front of the hall and looked out at the assembled room, and the room looked back at her, and for a moment she did not speak. Not from hesitation, but from the particular kind of stillness that comes when you find yourself inside a thing you built, looking at its full dimensions for the first time. "I want to begin," she said, "with something practical." The room settled. Every woman in this hall has managed something: a household, a ranch, a business, a family's legal and financial situation that someone else would have received credit for. That is not a complaint. It is a fact, and facts are where we begin. She looked across the rows of faces, young and old, weathered and smooth, with the specific mixture of tiredness and attention that characterized people who had come a long way for something they believed mattered. What this association exists to do is very simple. It takes the knowledge you already have and connects it to the processes that can make it actionable. It puts your name on the work you have already done. She paused. "I was 52 years old when I arrived in this county with nothing except what I knew," she said. "I am 55 now, and what I know has not diminished. None of yours has either." She looked at the youngest face she could find in the room, a girl who couldn't have been more than 17, sitting beside an older woman who was probably her mother, watching Eleanor with the concentrated look of someone taking an inventory of what was possible. It doesn't matter how old you are. It doesn't matter what they've said about you, or what they've taken from you, or how long you've been doing the work without the standing to show for it. She held the girl's gaze for a moment. You begin from where you are. That is the only place any of us has ever been able to begin. The room was very quiet. Not the quiet of an audience waiting for the next thing, the deeper quiet of people absorbing something they needed. Then Ruth Alcott, from the front row, said, "All right then, let's get to work." And Eleanor Whitaker, who had once stood on a blistering train platform and believed her future had already passed her by, looked at the room full of women who were about to prove the same thing she had proved, that wisdom did not diminish with age, that purpose did not expire, that the work of building something real was available to anyone willing to do it regardless of what the world had told them about their limitations. And she said clearly and without any ceremony at all, "Yes, let's." Outside, the Kansas plain stretched to the horizon in every direction, vast and honest in its scale, indifferent to the small and enormous things that happened across its face. The Broken Spur Ranch stood 12 miles south, its windmill turning in the morning air, its east pasture full and green, its accounts clean, and its name on the record in the way of something built to last. Somewhere in the county land office, filed alongside the official documentation of the Boggs case and the water rights settlement and the Larson property voiding, was a 16-page document in Eleanor's handwriting that would remain in the public record for as long as the office kept records. And in a hall in Ridgeline, a woman who had been told she was finished was standing in front of hundreds of lives that said otherwise, doing the work, because the work was what she had always been best at, and she was only just beginning to understand how much of it remained. End.